Good morning. This is lecture number one for the site translation for court interpreters class, English into Spanish. This is a continuation of your program. The prerequisite for this particular class is consecutive techniques and criminal terminology. So if you have completed that particular class, then you could be in this particular one. Site translation is a different type of class than any one that you have taken so far. Um, and the reason being that we are talking now about transferring a message that is in written form and transfer it verbally from one language into the other. Imagine, for example, that you are reading the paper in English, and as you read an article on the paper, you're saying it out loud for a person sitting next to you who speaks Spanish. And that will be this particular class. Obviously, there is a second class, which is the Spanish into English, in which case you would be reading the paper in Spanish and you are saying it out loud in English for an English speaker sitting next to you. So clearly, it's a different technique than simultaneous and consecutive in many respects. Number one, because you are transferring from a source that it is written to a target that it is verbal. In the case of simultaneous, your source was coming verbal and you were transferring verbally. And so it is for the consecutive mode. But when it comes to site, it's different source, but it's the same target. In other words, the source is in written format for site translation, and still the target is verbal. The way this works in most interpreting exams is that they will provide you a document, usually 3/4 of a page, and they will ask you to read it for a period of time, usually 2 minutes. Some exams will give you more time. They give you basically a total of 5 minutes to read it and to deliver it. But at state exam level, they give you 2 minutes to read the site. And then after you have read it for 2 minutes, you can now deliver. And when you deliver, it doesn't mean that in the 2 minutes you have to memorize the document. You're given 2 minutes so that you can actually check certain things on that document that could become a challenge in transferring those things into the opposite language. So there's a period of evaluation of the site, and there's a period of rendition. In a way, it's similar to consecutive if you think about it, because there is a period of acquisition when you hear the message, and there is a period of rendition. Here you have a period of evaluation and then a period of rendition. And what you do during that evaluation is rather critical, because when you are reading it to become familiar with the document, you not only want to become familiar with the document, but you also want to look into the possibility of some, I guess, tricky things that could be in the document, and that's part of this course, learning those tricky things. And therefore, that they could actually be problematic in the transferring. So the evaluation period, which is given to you as 2 minutes only, it's usually very short for 3/4 of a page to actually do a good job. So we need to develop a strategy for an exam, for the state examination, to be able to accomplish what we have to accomplish in a period of 2 minutes. It's going to be very difficult for you to be able to read 3/4 of a page, and on top of that, analyze the different possibilities in terms of transferring different words based on context in a period of 2 minutes. So we need to compromise here as to how you're going to do that. So we're going to learn what you do in that assessment or evaluation period. That assessment period of the site is actually that it's basically a compromise based on the time that you're given to read it. Of course, if you're given 5 minutes to read it, then you wouldn't have any compromise. but the state exam, as well as a federal exam, the federal exam, there is no period of time to read it, i.e., 2 minutes. But you got to read it and deliver it within 5 minutes, I believe, or 6 minutes. So we're concentrating more into the state exam at this point, and therefore we are given only 2 minutes and 4 minutes to render. So one of the purposes of this course is to learn how to what to do in terms of transferring, or how what to do in terms of identifying words that can be problematic at the time of transferring. So during our review process or assessment process of evaluation process, whatever you want to call it, of that site, when we read it for 2 minutes, we want to make sure that we can pinpoint those areas that could become problematic when it is transferred into the opposite language. And this is the part where you're going to be learning a lot today. And it will, in a way, give you for the very first time a way of formally, I would say, formally understanding, um, I guess, many of the things that have been discussed here in class in terms of transfers. As you probably know, all professions have their own jargon, their own way of expressing things. Two people that are, engineers working in a particular field, they have ways of understanding each other, and perhaps people that are from outside that field will not be able to understand what you're really discussing. Two doctors can communicate with each other, and people outside will not understand that what they're talking about, or will partially understand it. In the case of interpreting, we also have the same thing, although I have to admit that there is no formal literature at this point. Um, but the material I'm going to provide you right now is material that is part of a book that I'm publishing that will come out next year, which it will kind of put everything together and will give a more academic, um, or more professional look to the world of interpreting. So these are things you won't find anywhere yet, but you will find them only here when I'm teaching it. So it's pretty good stuff in many ways, and you will see that many of those things that we discuss that will make this, your own career will make it even more professional, because it will provide you the tools to be able to communicate with other fellow interpreters in a professional manner, instead of saying, "Oh, it sounds good." Sometimes you ask another fellow interpreter or translator, "I just translated this sentence. Can you tell me how is it?" And then the other person will say, "Oh, it sounds good." That's not a professional way of answering, right? There has to be a better way of answering. There has to be a better comprehension of why it sounds good. And in this class, you're going to learn that, or you're going to learn at least the beginning of that. So going back to the class and the technique itself, we have a period of review where you review the site translation. We're going to call it period of review. And then a period of rendition where you transfer that verbally. The review process is in written form. It's just a document. The transferring is actually verbal. So what are the challenges of this particular component in your state exam or in your interpreting exam? Well, there are many challenges. Um, if the direction is English into Spanish, in other words, if what's written is in English and you have to verbally say it in Spanish, if that's the direction, you're going to find that the challenges are different than if the direction is Spanish into English. So, but both of them have different challenges. Now, between these two, English into Spanish and Spanish into English, I would say that Spanish into English has at least 2 or 3 times more challenges than English into Spanish. And therefore, that's why this class compared to the next course is way easier. So we will talk about what you need to do during the class, but you're going to find yourself that you're going to have a lot of time, free time for this class, because the actual studying time is going to be reduced. There are no new words to study and so on and so forth, but I don't want you to waste your time not doing anything. So I know that many of you that took the misdemeanor and felony course, still trying to struggling with all those complicated structures and things like that. So, and being able to keep up with such fast speed, well, you're going to go back to your simultaneous and to your, misdemeanor and felony courses, and you're going to continue doing practices. We need to make sure that you can deliver the judge's bench guide in the misdemeanor course, the advisement of rights in the misdemeanor court, with a speed of 160 words per minute. And many of you, when I tested you in the last exam this last week in the felony course, you had not accomplished that yet. So this is a good time to do that. It will give you another 5 weeks to actually, in fact, more than 5 weeks, because we're going to have a very long break between this class and the next class, about 3 weeks or so, perhaps even more. So we'll talk about the scheduling later on. But the idea behind this class is not only to learn this material, but also to kind of review the material that we have already learned, mainly in the simultaneous and felony courses, which, as you know, those are the two courses that really make you an interpreter. So let's talk a little bit about this side translation and this idea of transferring from one language into the other, in this case from English into Spanish, and how that is actually done, and what are the challenges that we're going to be facing. So let's just do that. Let's see, here we go. Okay, so let me just switch this. So what we're going to do is we have now a document that is in written form, and it's written in English, and we're going to transfer it into Spanish in a verbal form. So this is written. The first stage is going to be the review process. And in that review process, we're going to look at, I can't use the nomenclature because I have not discussed that, but we're going to look at several potential issues in the transfer. You have a second portion, which is actually the rendition. This portion is for state exam 2 minutes. This portion is 4 minutes. So what are those several potential issues in the transfer? What are those? What exactly are we talking about when we say that there are several potential issues in the transfer? So let's just look at that. The first thing that we want to look at is the fact that many words should be classified in a way that it will tell us that the transfer will be without any problems or with problems. We call that stability test. And the stability test is the test that we put on a word to determine if the transfer will be direct or not. Another way of saying if the transfer will be stable or not. If I give you, for example, a word such as microphone, can you think of any other translation into Spanish besides micrófono? Think about it. So I know micrófono. Do you know of any other translation? Move this back a little bit. Oops. Well, if you actually look at this, the word micrófono is basically the only transfer that exists. When you have a transfer from one language into the other, in this case, English into Spanish, with only one possible meaning in the transfer, in this case, micrófono, and be aware that you may have synonyms of that. So we can say plus synonyms. I don't know of any synonym for micrófono, honestly. But if there was one, you would say, well, there are some synonyms and they mean exactly the same thing. They are the same. So when you have a situation like this, we say that the word micrófono is stable, and we use the word es to denote that. So if you were looking up at this word in a dictionary, there is no such a thing yet, but next year there will be. You will see the word like this, and then the different translations. And by seeing that letter S, it guarantees that any of these translations given to you will work for your context, because this one, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, they are all synonyms. And that's really good, because now we know that I can pick whichever I want, and I'm safe. It's a safe transfer. It's a stable transfer. Uh, you may say, well, all words are like that. Well, altavoz, I'm not sure if altavoz will be the transfer for micrófono. Usually that's for uh, bocinas, parlantes, altavoz. Those are the speakers. We're talking about a microphone. But if in that country that is used as altavoz, is perfectly correct. So if we have synonyms for this one, then the only thing that we need to worry about is, well, maybe this is a synonym that is used in Mexico, this is a synonym that is used in Colombia, whatever the case is. And then all we have to worry about is using the proper synonym or the proper word for that particular country. In other words, that will depend who is the one hearing the rendition. If the one hearing the rendition is from Mexico, then you will use the term that corresponds to Mexico. If the one hearing the rendition is from Colombia, you will use the term that corresponds to Colombia. That process of selecting a term that applies to that country has a name, and it's called localization. Usually denoted by the letter L. And what localization is actually defined as is basically using the transfer that is most familiar to the, in this case it's English into Spanish, non-English speaker. And we're not talking about him, we're talking about the country where he or she comes from. So if you have, if you just remove that so that you can see it better. So if you have, for example, a word, say, for example, just a simple word, money. Okay, well, that's dinero. Usually that's what it is everywhere at that register. But if you have, for example, dough, which is, it's a slang for money, then in one country such as Mexico, you will transfer that as lana, for example. And there might be a synonym for it at that register. Let's say, for example, in another country, you may transfer that as guita, which it will say for lana, I will say Mexico. For guita, I will say Argentina, for example. They are synonyms because they meet the basic requirement, which is actually that the message is the same in the target language. But they are not, they require localization, because if I have a Mexican individual sitting next to me while I'm doing this site, I wouldn't use guita, I would use lana. If I have an Argentinian, I would use guita, I would not use lana. So the idea of localization occurs with lots of times with idiomatic expressions, slang, and even regular terminology. You will be shocked to hear that does occur. For example, um, cocina, if you say kitchen, kitchen will be in in some countries it will be cocina. In other countries it may be called slightly different. If you say, for example, stove, in some countries maybe estufa, in other countries it will be called cocina, for example. So you're going to have a variation of terms that they do convey the same meaning, but that they at the same register, but that the localization is required so that the person who's receiving your message is actually more familiar with that term. If as I told you in the example below, uh, dough, when you transfer that into Spanish, when you may find many translations for dough. You may find guita, you may find um, eh, lana. Well, one lana is for one country, guita is for another country. So you need to pick based on localization. So when you have a situation that you're looking at a dictionary and it says dough, and actually, unfortunately, dough is a slang, but it is a stable slang. So the dictionary will mark it like that, and it will probably say lana, Mex, guita, Argentina, baro. I mean, there are many other ones. Let's just pick only two countries. So it means you can pick any of those, but this is a G, by the way, but you have to be very careful as to who the speaker, who the one receiving the message is. The problem uh, becomes even more difficult for those who translate written translation, because when we do a site translation, you are reading a document to a person. So the non-English speaker is one individual. It's the defendant. It's a witness. It's a person. It's a patient. Um, and that individual comes from a given country. So now you can switch into localizing into that country. So if that person comes from Mexico, then it will be you will use the term corresponding to Mexico. If that person comes from another country, well, then you will use those terms as well, whatever term corresponds to it. But you only have one person, and therefore you only have to worry about localizing into that country. Imagine, for example, when you translate it in written form and you publish and that is distributed in a whole city where the number of people coming from different countries is basically very numerous. Let's say in the city of LA or New York, when you do when you distribute that translation, you may get people from Puerto Rico, República Dominicana, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela, many other countries. So when you're actually translating, you cannot translate one phrase for each of those potential countries. You don't even know where these countries come from. So we usually transfer in a localization neutral mode. So that always requires, there's a price that we pay when that happens, and that is that the register is difficult to respect. Because if I have to translate in written form to a group of people coming from 15 different Spanish speaking countries the word dough, I can't really do that, because I may use lana, but that only works for one country out of those 15. I may use guita, but that works and I can't put all the different options, because then it doesn't flow. You can't read that. It becomes very confusing. Let alone the fact that sometimes some of these words that are used in one country, they mean something else in another country. So we do a localization neutral approach, and for dough, we transfer as dinero, because we know that dinero is understood everywhere. What price are we paying in doing that? Well, the price that we are paying is that we are not keeping register. So translators are always dealing with this issue as to whether to keep register or not to keep register in the transfer. And the question, of course, is when it comes to slang, particularly that you transfer from English into Spanish, if that material that is going to be distributed for everybody in a given city or town or whatever the case is, where there are many people that speak Spanish from different countries, at that time the translator has no other alternative than to actually pick between register or or localization. If you pick localization, you're going to use for dough lana, and then the other 14 countries they will even may understood that because lana in some countries means wool. If you pick dinero, everybody will understand it, but they're going to be missing the flavor of it, the register. Register is nothing else than the flavor of the word, right? So they're going to be missing the register. And if they miss that register, in their mind is, well, that's not a good thing, but there is no other alternative. What I'm trying to tell you is that when it becomes to translating document, it's basically the art of compromising in the transfers. And unless you know, for example, that you're translating a book that is going to go to Venezuela, so you use terms that are localized to Venezuela. The proper way of translating a book from English into Spanish that is going to be distributed in all Latin America, particularly if it has to do with, literature overall, is to translate it to each country different book. You will have a different book because there will be subtle differences that could make a huge impact in that country. So translating one book from English into Spanish, particularly literature book, say for example, I don't know, whatever book you want it to be, a book that even a movie. Look at the movies. I don't know if you've ever seen that. Those movies with subtitle. When you look at those movies, if you come from Mexico and that was actually the subtitle comes from another country, you're going to notice subtle differences. But those movies are translated. It's always cheaper, clearly, to use one translation for all Latin American countries. Besides, the people that will ask you to do this job may not have an understanding of these subtle differences or these localization principles and all that. So the translator has to compromise. So with the translator, and this is for the one who translates in written form, because the audience involves so many different countries, the translator will always have to compromise between the money that they are going to be paying to the translator, the knowledge that the translator has, because the translator may be very well versed in terminology coming from Mexico, but not necessarily from Venezuela. And also on whether to keep register or localize. That's more of a professional compromise. If you want to keep one version of the book for all countries, then register is going to be lost. If you do want to have more than one book and do things right, then clearly localization will be the best way to go, and you will have different type of books for different countries, which could be a headache for the publisher.